concerning new CDC report on the first severe human case of bird flu in the U.S. Mutations that could make it easier for this virus to spread from person to person.
The CDC says the bird flu has mutated as a 65-year-old patient in Louisiana is suffering the nation's first severe infection.
Russia's Ministry of Defense has released a statement revealing the murky activities of the United States military. The ministry says that Washington's Office of Pandemic Preparedness and Response Policy searches for virus mutations to then use them to further its own interests.
As in 2019, the United States began preparing for a new pandemic by searching for virus mutations.
Could make COVID look like a little pandemic, which was quite alarming. I mean, is that really the case?
Yes, Brian, I really do think it's very likely that we will at some time, it's not a question of if, it's more of a question of when, we will have a bird flu pandemic. As you mentioned, unfortunately, bird flu has, when it does enter humans, has a significant mortality, probably somewhere between 25 and 50% mortality. So it's going to be quite complicated. Once the virus gains the ability to attach to the human receptor and then go human to human, that's when you're going to have the pandemic. And as I said, I think it's just a matter of time.
The virus may mutate and become more easily transmitted person to person. So the more this virus circulates and specifically co-circulates with human strains, that's going to increase the odds of the virus evolving to more human-to-human transmission. And that of course, could signal another pandemic.
Joining us now is Dr. Deborah Birx. You may remember her as the response coordinator for the White House Coronavirus Task Force in the first Trump administration. We are very fortunate to have your expertise as we try to figure out what's going on with the bird flu and what it could mean. So far, 65 human cases of bird flu have been reported in the U.S. this year, all contracted by animals. But now we have this new mutation in Louisiana. How worried should we be about bird flu potentially becoming another pandemic?
Well, I love the way you said 63 cases, because I have no idea how many cases there were or are, because our number one principle in preventing pandemics is detect. And if you go to the CDC website, you can see that they're monitoring more than 10,000 exposures, but they've only tested 530. What does that mean? That means we're not testing enough. And we know from other viruses that a lot of the spread can be asymptomatic. So we kind of have our head in the sand about how widespread this is from the zoonotic standpoint, from the animal to human standpoint. Now, also remember, most of those cases described to date happened in the spring and the summer, not when we had H1N1 circulating right now, when we're running the flu pandemic with throughout the United States. So we have rising flu cases, and now we have still zoonotic events coming. So now you've set up for potentially a farm worker getting H5N1, also getting the current flu strain, and reassorting in that individual. To me, that's almost a bigger threat to these mutations happening in individuals over time.
When you say reassorting in that person, what does that mean?
Okay, so the H5 virus, which doesn't adapt too well to our upper respiratory tract and is preventing us from getting infected, but is infecting cows and pigs and cats and dogs. So our flu, which has the binding sites for us, for our nasal passages. Viruses are very specific, and so they're very animal or human specific. Now we have human flu circulating. At the same time, we have this zoonotic flu circulating.
We do not exclude the use by the United States of these so-called defensive technologies for offensive purposes, as well as for the purpose of global management by creating crisis situations of a biological nature.
According to the ministry, Washington has been amassing various pathogens from its direct involvement with various biolabs around the world, which they say are for research and preventative measures, but Russia's defense ministry is not buying that. And they point out that whenever the Pentagon, for example, is interested in any pathogens, be it or avian influenza or the African swine flu, they later somehow end up becoming pandemic. And who stands to benefit from this? As we've seen time and time again, it's American pharmaceutical companies. And they point out, their findings point out that, for example, that there is a possible collusion between Big Pharma and USAID via an intermediary company called EcoHealth Alliance. Now, they have been studying the diversity of bat population since 2015. And they've also been looking at mechanisms how to transfer strains from bats to humans. And we know that just 2 months before the world ever heard about COVID, there was an exercise conducted at the Johns Hopkins University in New York, where that exercise entailed scientists transferring an unknown at the time strain of from bats to humans via a pig. So, of course, all this and the office that is now being opened leads them to question why this is happening. And of course, they also point out that the U.S. government, for example, in May this year said that there's no longer a public health emergency when it comes to Joe Biden himself. Last September said that the pandemic is over, yet this July they are opening this Office of Pandemic Preparedness and Response Policy, which is led by a man who's a military combat surgeon and retired Air Force Major General. Why? In addition to this, documents that have been uncovered during Russia's special military operation in Ukraine point to the fact that there is a center called the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases actually plays a crucial role in all this, and they're the ones who are collecting all these dangerous pathogens from around the world in these biolabs, including one in Ukraine.
The U.S. Army Medical Research Institute for Infectious Diseases has been involved in U.S. biological programs in Ukraine. Thus, representatives of the institute actively led projects codenamed UP1 and UP8. As part of these projects, the possibility of using arthropods to spread Rickettsia, tick-borne encephalitis virus, as well as causative agents of Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever and auto-hunter viruses was studied.
That's why Russia's defense ministry believes that Washington is preparing to establish biological control, sort of using defensive technologies for offensive purposes to create biological crisis conditions and situations. And also there's added concern about the people involved in all this. For example, Dr. Anthony Fauci, America's leading doctor, who was the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. He has reportedly made a lot of money from this pandemic. And he's also the one who was adamant that when it comes to it came about naturally.
We have labs in Ukraine because we're developing bioweapons. So they transferred the authority for biosecurity to one agency in the HHS called the National Institute for Infectious and Allergic Diseases, run by Anthony Fauci. So Anthony Fauci got all the responsibility for bioweapons development. He got at that time a 68% raise from the Pentagon. 300 scientists wrote President Obama and said, you've got to shut down Anthony Fauci because he's going to create a microbe that will cause a global pandemic. And so Obama signed a moratorium that shut down the 18 worst of Anthony Fauci's experiments. And instead of obeying that law, Anthony Fauci shifted a lot of his operations offshore. And those operations ended up, most of them in the lab, which is a military lab, and that the Chinese run, the People's Liberation Army. And then a lot of them went to the Ukraine.
There will be those, of course, who will say that these are just all theories or Russian propaganda, but we are talking about specific examples, specific organizations, and let's not forget that Washington has itself admitted that it does have biolabs, including in Ukraine. And again, let's not forget just how terrified they were at one point in case their research there falls into the wrong hands, and how catastrophic that may be if it falls into Russian hands. So what that research there was all about, perhaps this is what we're talking about.
Dr. Wen, is bird flu in humans super dangerous?
Well, the World Health Organization estimates that in prior outbreaks of the bird flu, that the mortality rate is 52%. 52%. However, in this most recent outbreak, it seems that most cases have been mild, and maybe some people even have asymptomatic infection.
And it's not there, but California worries me because of all the spread in cattle in California. That's absolutely unprecedented, and that's why we have a level of alert here, and we need to be vigilant.
Concerning news from the CDC. The agency says H5N1 bird flu samples collected from a severely ill patient in Louisiana showed signs of mutation, differing from the samples collected from backyard flock believed to have infected the man.
We can actually show our viewers some of these numbers here. Now, confirmed total reported human cases in the United States, you can see it across the dairy herds, poultry farms, and then one other animal. Not a huge number there, but obviously troubling. What do you make of it?
Let's start with that mutation. How does that work, and is there cause for concern tonight?
Well, thanks for having me.
Sure.
And what we know from this case in Louisiana is that this patient, when they sequenced the virus, they noted that there were mutations that could potentially make this virus more susceptible to human transmission, so easily transmitted from person to person. Now, that said, there's some really important news here, and that is they sequenced the virus that was found in the backyard flock of birds and the virus from this person, and those birds did not have a mutation that showed any kind of adaptation to humans. So really, this happened in that person, and we think that's really important because it means that what's circulating in the birds is actually not something that's transmissible from person to person at this point. So that's really the important piece of news here. Now, that said, there was some data that suggests that this strain is only a few mutations away from becoming transmissible. So good to keep our eye on it.
Let me sort this out for you, Griffin. I've talked to top officials at CDC over the past week about this. There's two different types of bird flu out there. The one in the dairy cattle that you're seeing, 866 herds already, 660 in California. That's the type called B313. Fancy name, but what it means is when it actually infects humans, it's mild. The symptoms have been mild across the board in that particular subtype. Now, we have to monitor that because it's spreading a lot among the dairy cattle. It's spreading through milk machines, through milking, and occasionally it gets to a farm worker. We have to figure out a way to control that. The second type is in the poultry, which we've seen for 2 decades now. And occasionally we've seen a mutation, D1.1 it's called, where you get a very severe illness, much more severe than you get with the dairy cattle, generally in the type in birds. But now they're seeing something where in the last 2 patients, one in British Columbia, one in Louisiana, where it actually got into upper airways fairly easily. That's what we are concerned about, but the good news is they know where the 2 got it from. The one in Louisiana got it from a backyard bird, and there's no sign of any spread whatsoever.
The infected person was hospitalized after coming in contact with sick and dead birds on their property, though the CDC says the mutations were not found in those animals. Since March, more than 60 milder cases have also been identified in the U.S. Nearly all infected worked on dairy or poultry farms. This month, California Governor Gavin Newsom declared a state of emergency over the virus.
Hi, Griff. The CDC says a genetic analysis indicated that a mutation of the virus was discovered inside a Louisiana patient. This person contracted the first severe case of H5N1 in the nation. The patient is one of the 66 confirmed bird flu cases in humans in 10 states across the U.S., including California, Michigan, and Texas. There was no evidence that the Louisiana patient passed the illness to anyone else. Health experts say the genetic analysis from the Louisiana patient indicates the virus evolved in a way that can make it more transmissible to humans because it more easily binds to the cell receptors in the upper respiratory tract. Nearly all of the 66 confirmed human cases involve people who were infected after working on dairy or poultry farms. California has had at least 650 dairy farms with cows infected with the bird flu, more than any other state.
I'm much more concerned about California than anywhere. California worries me because of all the spread in cattle in California. That's absolutely unprecedented, and that's why we have a level of alert here, and we need to be vigilant.